We do want to turn our attention now, though, to the guest we can bring on board now. It is one member of the Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame, a 5-time AFL All-Star, and still the Bills' all-time leader in career interceptions with 40, and the all-time leader in interception returns for touchdown with 5. It is one Butch Byrd joining us on the line. Butch, how you doing? Thanks for joining us here on a Friday.
Doing pretty good.
Well, that's good to hear. I know this is Black History Month, and part of the reason we wanted to get you on was to kind of take us back to the 1965 AFL All-Star Game, which was really a seminal moment for not only you, but, all of your Bills teammates that were down there as well. I know you were down there with Ernie Warlick, Golden Wheels, and Cookie that year.
Yep.
Why don't you just take us to the beginning of that weekend? Because from what I have read and from what I understand, the people that were organizing the game down there, along with the AFL commissioner, Joe Foss, the general consensus was, hey, feel free to bring your wives and children down. It's going to be a family event, this, that, and the other. So I'm curious what your initial impressions were back then as you were making plans to make your way down there.
Well, let's see. First of all, I was very excited to be elected to the All-Star team. And I had never been to New Orleans beforehand, so I was really excited to go. I got a phone call one day from Jack Horgan, who was the VP of Buffalo, and he asked me to come into his office, and I did, but not knowing why. And then the first words out of his mouth was, you're going to have a good time in New Orleans. And I said to myself, why is he saying that? Because of course I'm going to have a good time. But apparently some other black ball players from other teams were skeptical about playing in New Orleans. And they were from the South and had reasons to be skeptical. So anyway, I got on the plane, flew into New Orleans, and approached the first cabbie at the airport, who happened to be white. And he said to me, well, I'm on my break. So I said, okay. So the next cabbie was white, and he had another plausible reason for not taking me to the hotel. But the third cab was the black guy. And he came, and he says, you must be one of the ball players coming to New Orleans. I said, I am. And he says, I'll take you to the hotel. So we rode to the hotel. I was excited. Again, just being in New Orleans for the first time, to the hotel. And one of the strangest things started happening was that the hotel clerk at the desk, I walked up and he wouldn't look at me. And he says, could I help you? But never looked up. And I said, my name is Butch Byrd. I'm here with the All-Star team, blah, blah, blah. And he says, well, here's your keys. And still never looking up. And he said, your room number is such and such. So I started to walk away, not really thinking much about that. Just happened to be there. And then 2 black ball players from the team happened to enter the hotel. And they were really upset. And they were upset because they were denied entrance to a restaurant on Bourbon Street. And they were just talking and just lamenting how bad things were. But I still had my bag, so I said, let me go to my room, put my bags away, and then come back down and find somebody I know. I came back down, and by the time I got back to the hotel lobby, I would say maybe a dozen or so black ball players had gathered. And each had a story about how he was being mistreated. I didn't know, I recognized the faces, but I didn't know anybody there. So one of the guys said, well, let's go to some place where we can be comfortable. And they walked out to the cab stand, and I followed, and they took us to a place called, what was it, Dewdrop Inn, an all-black establishment. And We all sat around. It was great music and so forth. And then we're there for about maybe a half hour. Then Ernie Ladd, the defensive tackle for the Chargers at the time, walked in, and he was really upset. And I don't know if it was his size or the volume of his dissent, but he was very impressive. And I was standing there looking at him, and he was talking about trying to get into a restaurant on Bourbon Street and a gun being pulled on him by one of the bouncers. And they argued back and forth, and then the police showed up, didn't take an active role in this argument, but their presence was intimidating, according to Ernie. But he was just he was led to believe things were different, and things weren't really that different at all. The following day, I got a phone call from Cookie, and he says there's a meeting being held at Room, and I forget the number. He says you got to be there. So I said okay. So I went to this room, and it was packed with ball players, both white and black. And there were four guys who were leading the charge, if you will. One was Jack Kemp, the other was Ron Nix, Cookie, and Ernie Ladd. And each were Ernie and Cookie were against playing the game, and they were giving their reasons against playing the game in New Orleans. And Nix and Kemp were giving their reasons why we should play the game. And as I said, the room was full of ball players just listening. And the arguments went back and forth and so forth, and some of the guys would speak up. Most of the speakers were black. And the reason why, in my mind, the white guys didn't speak up is because they weren't being treated the way the black guys are being treated. They were just listening. So anyway, I think about maybe a half hour into the discussions, or maybe a little bit longer, Ron and Jack got a phone call from somebody, and they left the meeting to talk to the promoters of the game. And they came back armed with why we should play the game. And one of the reasons Jack gave was that race relationships would be much enhanced if we played the game, and that went over like a lead balloon. The other reason was that the promoters were going to lose a lot of money if we didn't play the game, and again, no one cared about that at all either. So they talked, and there was a lot of disagreement back and forth. And the black ball players from San Diego said, I'm sorry. They said, let's take a vote. And the black ball players from San Diego said that no matter how the vote went, play or not to play, they weren't playing, and they were getting the next plane out to San Diego. Well, at that particular point, Ron Nix, who was a Charger at the time, said, well, if my teammates are leaving, I'm leaving. And so that decided for everyone. The meeting broke up, and everyone headed to the airport. Everyone, I would say the black ball players especially, were nervous. No one wanted to be the last one out of New Orleans based on the situation. We got to the airport, and we had our tickets, and then there was an announcement that the plane from Buffalo had been delayed. And everyone just said, well, we're in trouble. It was just an apprehensive type of atmosphere at the time. But nothing happened. Everyone went home. But when we got home, we were told that the game was going to be in Houston, get back on a plane, head to Houston, and that's what we did. After the game, I came back to Buffalo, and that's when I really began to realize just how significant the boycott had been. And at the time, it wasn't called the boycott. It was called the boycott afterwards. Well, anyway, newspaper people from around the country were calling me, wanting interviews as to what happened. And the upshot of the whole thing was that this was the first time black athletes had boycotted any event with any kind of success. And people had to pay attention to what blacks in the professional leagues were demanding. And that sentiment lasted constantly for about 2 weeks. I was getting phone calls and so forth. And I think it made a difference, at least for a while. And that's my story.
It took a lot of strength and courage for you guys to stand up like that and to say, we're not going to play this game because we've been treated terribly by people in New Orleans and by people who have traveled into town from New Orleans for the game. And I think about what type of effect that had on the NFL at that time and think about how important something like that was to events and to things that happened down the road. When you think back to making that decision, to being in that room with those men, making that decision and walking away and being worried about what would happen and the effects of what would happen, but seeing how the game eventually did get moved and you guys were able to do something successfully, do you understand or do you think it had a bigger effect now down the road as we are in 2021 and seeing where this country is now, things that you guys did that led the way for players in the future?
Well, it clearly was the beginning of something great to happen. I just think that at that particular time, I was, 21 or 22 years old, born in the North, didn't have the experience of some of the black ball players had in the South. And so, to be honest with you, I was just learning what racism was all about. I'd never had any personal major experiences in that vein. But some of the black guys were adamant that they weren't going to put up with this treatment. And besides, they were led to believe that things had changed, and they were looking for change. So I think that in future years, as we talk today, people remember those days, and I think it did have some effect on how the game progressed and how black ball players were treated.
So Butch, and just to be clear in your storytelling, Ron Mix, the guy that supported his Chargers teammates, he was a white player, and one of the first white players to say, well, if my black teammates aren't playing, then I'm not going to play either, when you guys were all congregated there still down in New Orleans. My question, though, is I'm curious, in the conversations you may have had with your Bills teammates, Cookie, Elbert DeBenion, Ernie Warlick, who were all down there with you. Obviously, Elbert and Ernie had grown up in the South, in Georgia and North Carolina. They were obviously exposed to a lot more of this prejudice than you were growing up in New York State. My question to you, though, is how much did this experience open your eyes and tune your antenna, if you will, to that kind of prejudice after that?
Well, let's see. As far as my personal eyes they were open wide, because again, I have never experienced anything like that, and I've never been afraid because of my race until that New Orleans episode. Some of the other guys, Ernie, Warlick, and Cookie, and Albert, they experienced it. They knew what was going to happen or what could happen. I didn't. All I was doing is feeding off their fears that made me more afraid than ever.
I think about players also like Marlon Briscoe and Shaq Harris and what they were able to give to the NFL and give to the game. And we were blessed with the opportunity to speak to Shaq Harris for a story that we're doing. And his stories of coming up and getting into the NFL and going through college ball were probably quite different from yours, since he grew up in the South. And when we were talking to him just about choosing to go to Grambling, where he played college football, his answer was, I went to Grambling to play for Eddie Robinson, a great college football coach, but I also went to Grambling because I had no other choice. Schools were still segregated in the South when I was going into college football. And by the time I got to the NFL, it was my first experience being around white people. And I had to learn as a quarterback how I was supposed to lead a team full of white men when I had never really been around white people before. I didn't have that skill set. And he was able to find that leadership. And he talked about Marlon Briscoe as being someone who really helped him along the way, and several teammates that he had on his team during that time to help him fall into that leadership roles. But what do you think players like that gave to the game and gave to NFL based on their experiences, and how you said, it was different than you being growing up in New York and going to somewhere like Boston University. It didn't seem like it was too much of a jump to go into the NFL based on some of the experiences that these other players had.
Well, I think I had, as far as integrating myself with the team, I think I had a far easier time than some of the guys from the South, only because white ball players were the rule of the day. I played with white ball players all my life, from high school all the way up through college, so there was no difference. Shaq was the quarterback, but he had a problem to start with. I mean, controlling the huddle, talking to white ball players, getting them to run the plays he called, and they would openly disagree with him because they knew that at his young age, he was intimidated, if you will. He did get by that and became a great quarterback, but he struggled. I don't think Marlon struggled that much. He was a great athlete. I don't know where Marlon grew up, but he just seemed to have his act together all the time.
Butch, the last one I've got for you is, I'm curious, having been part of such a groundbreaking event as the 1965 AFL All-Star Game boycott, and I'll call it that for, lack of a better term, how much did the events that we saw last calendar year in terms of race relations affect you? Were you disheartened by it that here we are 50 some odd years later and some of the same types of issues? You just talked to us about how Ernie Ladd was, harassed by police after being refused service at a restaurant. And here we are 50 years later, and issues with police and race relations are still a major factor. So with all that took place last calendar year, I'm just curious, for someone that was part of a groundbreaking event back in the mid-'60s, how did it impact you this past year?
Well, I think it wasn't just last year, but I think the last 4 years have set us back tremendously. I hate to say that, but I believe it. For the very first time, traveling outside and having a police car get behind me, I got nervous. One of my best friends in Westboro, the town I live in, was the former chief of police. And I went to him and I was telling him my story about how I was nervous when cop cars came behind me. And it was all by chance, but you never knew. And he kind of just sat down and said, "You don't have anything to worry about. about Westboro. We're going to treat you right. But to answer your question, it just wasn't Westboro. It was all over. I mean, I didn't feel safe any longer. And I'm close to 80 years old now.
Right.
And for this to happen, this Floyd incident, the person in Staten Island who got strangled, the black guy, I mean, it's just, and it seems pervasive. And I worry about, I've got two older sons. One is very opinionated. I mean, he's very bright, and he'll argue with anyone about anything. And I worry about him driving and being stopped, and he's thinking he's in the right and what can happen. So we're in a dangerous time in my way of thinking. I'm impressed. I just listened to Biden a little bit just about an hour ago, and he impresses me. But I just wonder, how the country is going to act in the future. What was it? 73 million people voting against him. I mean, that's amazing to me. So I'm worried.
What do you think it will take to get this country to a place where you're not worried anymore, and you're not worried for your sons, and you feel at ease when people walk into the world? I hate that a group of people, and several groups of people, feel like they're not equal in this world, and it's obvious in several different ways. We can wake up and I see racism in front of me, and I watch it happen to people, and I want to be there to take a stand and to push for equality for all, because it is not fair what people like you and your sons have to go through just because they have a different color of skin. So what do you think it's going to take? Is it not fostering hate in your heart and having more love?
Well, what I really believe is we have to address, just not talk about it, but really do something about it. For instance, when I hear about how black and brown people aren't getting the vaccine as compared to the number of whites, that raises a question in my mind. Why is that happening in this day and age? I just think that there's a level of animosity toward people who are different that I thought we were virtually past. But I don't believe that's true any longer. What has to happen? I think employment, getting people back to work, getting people's minds off their problems, because somehow I believe people think their problems are being caused by people like me, my color, which is, I don't think I'm being facetious in that. People always want to blame somebody else for things that happen bad, and now it's great. It's like the former president when the black ball players were taking a knee. Why get involved in that? I mean, that's their right. Whether I agree with it or not, it's their right. And for him to say, "Oh, wouldn't it be great for someone to fire them and get them off the field?" I mean, all that does is just separate everyone from each other.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Butch, we are out of time, but we appreciate the time you gave us and shedding some light on what was a very momentous act by you and your fellow players in the AFL back in 1965. We appreciate you taking us back to that time and letting us know how it is. I don't think there's any debate on our parts that the country is very divided, and for reasons that for some of us is still difficult for us to understand. I think more people, instead of getting offended by the actions and the protests, need to be asking why people are taking those actions and protests instead of getting offended by them. And maybe if they take the time to try to understand, we can make some headway in this area. But thanks very much, Butch, for your time. We do appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
And all the best to you and your family going forward.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, take care, Butch. Be safe out there. Butch Byrd, Bill's Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame member.